notre premier orateur, qui est une oratrice d'ailleurs, ce qui est heureux, c'est Adrienne Parr, qui a le grand avantage d'être au départ une Australienne. Elle est née en Australie, mais elle a fait toute sa carrière, et elle fait toute sa carrière aux États-Unis. Et son avantage dans les choix qu'elle a suivis, c'est d'avoir été au fond la fille d'artistes, et une tante aussi qui était artiste, et qui lui a permis au fond aussi d'être sensible à l'interconnexion entre le monde des arts, la justice sociale et la justice environnementale. Elle est très engagée donc dans la défense du développement durable, dans toutes ses applications matérielles, aussi artistiques, et donc l'architecture, le design, etc. Et donc je lui cède volontiers la parole maintenant.
The mic, because I'm probably going to walk around a bit.
Your pleasure.
Thanks. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. I'm actually not going to present a formal paper. I think if you want to read my work, you're more than welcome to read some of the books and the articles that I've written. What I'm going to talk to you about today is a more recent project that I've been working on called The Intimate Realities of Water. And it's the result of very much of my UNESCO Water Chair appointment. I'm one of 30 UNESCO water chairs in the world, but I'm the only one, as far as I know, who is a humanities and social justice person. So I bring a very different perspective to the table. And this project started when I was in Nairobi, visiting different kinds of water technologies and management solutions in the slums of Nairobi. And I was visiting those sites to try to understand the ways in which we could make the projects more culturally appropriate, which inevitably meant that I ended up spending a lot of time talking to a variety of people who lived in the slums, who have either grown up in the slums or who had migrated to the slums. So the project that I'm about to describe to you in many ways resonates, I think, with a lot of the themes that have been raised thus far in the conference. This idea of emotional knowledge, Mariette Westerman's comments on, what it is that we have in common, and also what separates us, and recognising also what are our shared experiences. Chris Carey's comments around telling stories and the importance of exploring different ways of narrativizing things, and also recognising that whilst there are competing narratives, often the issue at hand is how do you test those competing narratives. And then, as someone who's been trained in philosophy, I would say that the project starts from the premise of trying to deconstruct a Eurocentric view of development, and also Eurocentric narratives that underpin those views of development. I'm also deeply indebted to the work of Deleuze and Spinoza, and in particular the work of Rosie Braidotti, so it's a tremendous honour for her to be here in the audience today, thinking about issues of affect. So as we tell one story and then someone else shares their story, how does that connection between storytelling, how do those stories affect each other? So the project also started from a very intense moment that I had in the slums one day, and I was with my dear friend Kadiri going through the Dagoretti slum, and a young man stumbled out of the illegal brewery and fell into me and grabbed me, and he said, "I love you." And then he pushed me away and he said, "And I hate you," right? And I thought, and Kadiri was very worried and said, "Oh, I'm terribly sorry." I said, no, it's fine. And I sort of talked to the young man, and I realised afterwards, he's absolutely right. I'm a white woman. I have a UNESCO title. I come to this place with tremendous privilege. I get to go home every day, have a wonderful meal, sleep in a comfortable bed, and come back again. So how can the project that I'm doing here in some way be honest about that struggle? And what it meant was that I had to push all the IRB documents to one side the surveys that I was obligated to use in order to speak to somebody, and just take a risk and spend time in people's homes, eating with them, laughing with them. I got to know so many mothers in the slums, and just listening to their stories, and together we decided, how do you want to be represented? How do you want to tell your story? Because I don't want to be in a situation where I am telling it for you, because I'm making decisions about what goes into the narrative and what doesn't go into the narrative. And so we came up with this idea to create a film together, where they would take me through the slums and they would show me their daily life and how water shapes their life and how they shape water in the slums. So we'll show a quick snippet of that right now. It's a 7-minute snippet. Hello, down the back there. Christopher? No. Nicholas. IT. We're going to show the film right now. Thanks. It's just a 7-minute trailer. It's not the whole film.
Water shapes, changes, and realigns the bodies, landscapes, buildings, and public spaces of Nairobi's slums. It oscillates in between hard and soft surfaces, making them porous and supple, and sometimes bringing them to breaking point. Lives are structured around how much water costs, where it flows, when it doesn't, how it falls, and how quickly or slowly it travels throughout a tightly knit urban fabric. Leaking through the cracks and crevices of flimsy structures, flooding dirt pathways and homes, water transports garbage, debris and bodily waste throughout streets and alleyways. The wild downpours of the rainy season rapidly turn fatal when water and sanitation infrastructure are in short supply. Moving quickly and relentlessly, these waters expose those who cross its path to cholera, typhoid and hepatitis.
Okay, well guys, we are the problem and we are the solution to our problems. Can we sit down and talk about how we can clear our space, how we can have a public space for our kids, like a play area, how we can manage the solid waste that we have amongst us.
Thick black pools of water stand still despite the loud and lively rhythms that surround them. It's here where the withered and worn bodies of pigs, goats, stray dogs, cats and chickens come to quench their thirst. They drool and snort amidst the trash-filled fluid whilst children happily play along the edges. Liquid concoctions inebriate and placate the idle bodies of addicts and the desperate. Day in and day out, women are dragging, lugging, pushing and pouring water from colourful jerry cans. They carefully and confidently navigate the litter, mud and sewerage as they make their way to and from the water point each day. Some do this several times a day. The arrangement of tiny interior spaces, home to anywhere between 4 and 13 people, is provisional and flexible. Furniture, clothing, food, cooking utensils, people and water storage systems are continually reconfigured to make room for washing, cooking, eating, entertaining, sleeping and flooding. Following water traces that move throughout Nairobi's slums, new development models are discovered. Grassroots projects that offer exciting experiments in small-scale infrastructure. Using local materials and skills, we meet designers who view collaboration and community participation as a core principle of design. Together they build flexible spaces that address both the need for water and sanitation, as well as providing new economic and training opportunities for slum residents.
And what do you like about this job?
It has changed me a lot, let me say.
It did?
It has changed me a lot.
In what way?
In a way that I don't have to call someone to fix things for me. I can fix, maybe if the pipe is broken, leaking, I know what to use, which parts to use, and where can I find those parts. Yes.
Water brings us face to face with the intimate realities of everyday life in the slums. Those slow, quiet, methodical and dark moments where life and death hold hands. All those spaces where fragility and strength greet each other. Here water lengthens the day, affects the quality of daily life and organises the very texture and tempo of urban life.
So the film, which is about 47 minutes long, features 4 women who really wanted to spend extra time with me, you know, shooting inside their homes, going through the streets with them. A lot of that footage was taken together. And then it also goes on to look at some of the development models that have been introduced into the slums and the impact that some of those models are having on people. It is the result of a really fruitful collaboration between myself, Sean Hughes and John Hughes. One's a filmmaker, he does the editing, and he helps me direct it. And then John Hughes, who's a photographer. And it's also the result of a lot of time given over by Jelid, who is the head of UNESCO office in Nairobi, and my dear friend now, Kadiri, who grew up in the slums and is still living there now, and we're still in touch with one another. That's Sean, John, Kadiri's there on the right, and there's Mohammed Jelid from the Nairobi office in UNESCO. And what's happened now, the project went on to be shown at UNESCO Water Celebration, the 50th anniversary of water at head office in Paris, the COP talks. So it became the basis for some really interesting policy discussions around more sensitive kinds of development models that are more inclusive and more collaborative of local populations that are living in the slums. In addition to winning some awards at the film festivals throughout the States last year. And it got me kind of thinking that, you know, not only are a lot of these issues occurring in the global south, but my experiences in visiting many of the sort of low-income communities within the global south, including the slums in Nairobi, ended up resulting in me casting a spotlight on my own home territory back in the United States. I'm originally Australian, but I live in the United States. And I started to sort of look at what are the minority communities in the United States that are suffering from similar water challenges, and I ended up in the backyard of the Native American community. And this has now led to phase 2 of the Intimate Realities of Water project. I've just received a grant to complete that. I'm relieved to say, because this is a very expensive process. And it's resulted in more extensive collaboration. Tara Huska, who was the Native American advisor to Bernie Sanders and is a tribal attorney, Bob Goff, Indigenous rights attorney, and the secretary of the Intertribal Council, Ken Tankersley, who's the member of the Cherokee Nation, and Black Bear, who is not featured up here because he doesn't want his photo to be out there. He's a very shy gentleman, and shared with me a really moving poem about the struggles that his community has encountered, and the voiceover, no visual, will appear in the final film. Now, this project is looking at the ways in which water shapes the lives of our Native American communities in the United States. And it's meant travelling to Alaska, to a really remote area in Shishmaref, off the coast of Alaska, where that community, the Inupiaq community, is basically disappearing into the ocean. They lose a couple of miles of land every year. And this is Stella. I spent quite a lot of time there documenting the ways in which that community is slowly disappearing into the oceans. And they had applied for a federal grant to be relocated, but they were denied the grant because they didn't prove sufficiently that climate change is impacting their way of life. It's also resulted in me going down to southeast Louisiana, which is the Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw tribe. They're the first so-called climate refugees because they did win one of the HUD grants. And I was deeply astonished to find just how similar their living conditions were as compared to the living conditions of people that I'd spent years sharing their lives with in the slums of Nairobi. And this was happening in the United States of America. So the point being, you know, as you kind of go out into the world and you get affected by other people's stories and you begin to kind of overlay them with your own sort of memories and stories of where you're living and what you see, and you start to kind of become more conscious of what's happening also in your own backyard. So it was really important that phase 2 went back to my own country where I'm living, and I'm still in contact with Kadiri a lot. And we have this interesting conversation now about what I'm witnessing back at home, and he's sharing with me what's going on still back there because I'm still very close with that community. So phase 2, this is some more photos from Alaska. This is photos of members of the tribe of the Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw tribe. They won, I think, $43 million, I think it was, from the government, or 48 million, one or the other. And a year later, they still hadn't been moved. And I found out that the money had been held up at the state level, and the argument that the state official made on camera, I got him on camera saying this, was that it would be discriminatory to not include the other households on the island in the move. And that was enabling them to justify not giving the money to the tribe. But the households he was talking about are white people's homes who have moved there in a predatory way, bought housing off the tribal members who were suffering from, you know, leaky homes, mildew homes because of all the storms that had come through and so on and so forth. And they had bought them as holiday places where they could go on the weekend and go fishing. So this community, as far as I know, still hasn't moved. This is 2 years later, and I'm going back there with the film crew in a few months to just follow up on that situation there. But it's quite sad. This is a photo taken in Alaska. These are the sticks that the Inupiaq put across the ice so that when you travel out on the ice, you don't get lost and figure out your way back. One of the most common stories that members of the Inupiaq shared with me was that they're losing people now from the community. They're going out on the ice, and the oral knowledge that they've been given that tells them how thick the ice is, namely it's deep blue, has changed. Now deep blue can also mean that the ice is very thin. And the mayor's uncle actually was with his dogs and his friend out on the ice seal hunting. The ice broke off and they were floating out in the ocean for 2 weeks. And they ended up having to eat one of their dogs. And they were very lucky to make it to shore. They struggled. His friend had already collapsed. Her uncle struggled to kind of move the ice that was left to the shoreline, and then they swam into shore when they got close enough. They were so hypothermic that it took them a week to kind of defrost their bodies before they could actually go inside again. These are the kinds of stories that are not being told in the United States at the moment, and especially with the president who says he doesn't believe, Steve and I were talking about this, doesn't believe in climate change science. Oh dear. All right, this is a photo from down in Louisiana from the chute. So everywhere we went in the marshlands here were oil pipes, everywhere. And it got to the point where I couldn't read the difference between the swamp and the oil pipes, right? So part of the problem that the community there is facing is that when the oil industry moved in, they started to gut all those waterways. So it's like Swiss cheese. They've been drilling holes into it, which has made the Biloxi, Chittamacca, Choctaw tribes' land even more vulnerable to all coastal erosion and so on and so forth as the storms come in. This is, okay, so the trailer, that's the kind of thing that folks are living in. And the lady that Teresa that I spent time with in her trailer was there with her daughter and her grandchild. It was covered in mould and it was leaking as we were speaking with one another. It was a deeply distressing situation. And once again, my film crew came out. They were completely traumatised by this. I mean, it was a really bad situation. And, you know, the thing was, they say, we look to the global south and we point there and we go, look how bad that situation is over there and it's happening under our own noses. You know, and a psychoanalytic way of thinking about that is it's a displacement activity. We end up telling somebody else's story because we feel we can have power over it over in another country, but we don't turn around and invite the stories on our own home turf that align in many ways with those stories. So this is these are stories about inequity the world over. They're trying to deconstruct the sort of north-south power relation, and they're trying to do that through this sort of affective medium of narration and trying to hand the microphone over to minority communities and enable them to have a platform upon which they can tell their own story. And then it's overlaid with my own story of how that kind of impacts me. So part of this process is also putting yourself in a position of vulnerability where it forces you to think about yourself and what constitutes positions of privilege and how might that interaction somehow deconstruct that. Thank you very much.
Merci. Thank you. Merci Adriane, à double titre, à la fois par le report des témoignages dont vous avez été le témoin et dont vous avez été le recueilleur, mais aussi de votre propre engagement d'ailleurs. Ce sont deux engagements dont on doit se souvenir. Je vais passer la parole ensuite à Stephen Hartman, qui lui aussi s'est imprégné d'études aux États-Unis et puis qui est retourné à la Mid-Sweden University où il a des cours aussi en langue anglaise, je pense, mais qui s'est engagé à titre de géographe et de responsable du tourisme dans ce processus de la conscience environnementale. Et je pense qu'il s'applique, comme il l'a indiqué lui-même, à décrypter les politiques publiques de l'environnement. Je crois qu'on aura grand plaisir à vous écouter. À vous, Steve.
Merci. Thank you very much. I really want to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak to you today. And I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach to this presentation than the one we just heard, and these fascinating cases that we just heard about in terribly important work. I'm going to zoom back and try to get more of an overview of this academic and research area that's come to be known as the environmental humanities. And to that end, I'm just trying to make sure I've got this right with the, I don't know if I do. Hold on a second, sorry. Which one do you, the big green one, okay. Oh, up there, sorry, okay. Yeah. So to begin with, I'm used to actually following it on a monitor this way too, so I'm going to try to follow along as we do this. To this end, I want to begin by foregrounding a couple of questions. First, how can knowledge be organized and mobilized optimally to address the pivotal social, ecological issues of our time? And two, how can humanities scholars in particular apply their knowledge, perspectives, and expertise to some of the world's most pressing challenges? Among these, we could list many, but here's just a few, and I'm not going to read down through the list as it is. But each of these are areas that humanities scholars can make vital contributions to understanding better. Sorry, I'm sorry. I have to make sure that I time these two together. I think it's important to pause for a moment and consider this idea of the crisis of the humanities. There is no crisis. This is a red herring. The humanities know precisely what they're about, and what they're about is a variation on what they have been about since knowledge began to be organized in institutions of higher learning. Likewise, the environmental humanities is nothing new under the sun. It has a long and distinguished history. Since antiquity, philosophers and poets, artists and critics have been preoccupied with questions concerning the relation of human beings to nature. Preoccupied not only with the question of what that relation is, but also how it should be. In other words, the ethics and normative dimensions of human existence in the environing world. Ursula Heise is a leading figure within environmental humanities. She's at UCLA. She's a fantastic literary critic and cultural theorist. Ursula says the environmental humanities are currently emerging from the convergence of research areas that have followed distinct disciplinary trajectories to date: eco-criticism, environmental philosophy, environmental history, biological and cultural anthropology, and several more. What's new in all of this? Well, I would argue that what is new is the clear rise of this area as an institutional presence in higher education and research. And secondly, I would argue that what is new is the cross-pollination of ideas, theories, methods, approaches, and mutual familiarity with findings that transect disciplinary boundaries. I'll just give you a little bit of a really quick overview of how this area, just in the last few years, has exploded. What we have here are programs in environmental humanities in Europe, in North America, in Australia, that have been developed in just the last few years. In my own country, Sweden, there was a major initiative by two research funding agencies, Mistra, the Strategic Environmental Foundation, Research Foundation, and Formas, the state agency for research financing that typically finances environmental science. What was notable about the seed boxes, they won a big national competition where millions and millions of euros over essentially an 8-year period were put into the humanities by what have up till now been really agencies and foundations closed to humanities projects. And I think that this is a sign that the environmental humanities is there now and is being recognized by the people who, dish out the funds. Here we have, again in Sweden and in the case of Denmark at the very bottom in the Nordic countries, just a few of the environmental humanities programs that have been launched in the last few years. Here we have important resources, web portals on the environmental humanities that are being launched and have been launched in the last few years as well. Some of them Anglophone, some of them Francophone, and they are really important resources where knowledge is being organized and resources are being made available to students, to the general public, in ways that I think represent a serious contribution to popular understanding of environmental issues and the link between culture and environment. Here's some examples of a few monographs, let's say in the last 10 years or so, that have come out that have made huge impacts. Rob Nixon's The Slow Violence and Environmentalism of the Poor, Merchants of Doubt from Eric Conway and Naomi Oreskes, from essentially science and technology studies. And then Lawrence Buell's Writing for an Endangered World from Literature and Environment Studies. These are just the journals that we can identify with environmental humanities, and many of them are explicitly environmental humanities journals that have developed in recent years. The oldest one of these probably there's a couple of them that may go back to the 90s, including Isle, when eco-criticism began to be organized seriously. But many of these are really just in the last few years. So we've got journals, we've got publishing series from all of the major academic publishers. And that's also new with specific environmental humanities focuses. Here we have conferences. I've taken most of these just from the last year. I think it's only one from the University of Utah up in the far top right corner is from a few years ago. But these are all different conferences. And this is a small number of the total number of them in the last year that have actually been devoted to environmental humanities questions and to congresses and constellations of different, often from different disciplines, environmental humanities scholars. In this connection, a really important initiative that's happened in the last few years is the launch of the Humanities for the Environment Global Observatory Network. This was started a few years ago with a grant from CHCI, the Consortium for Humanities Centers and Institutes, through the Mellon Foundation, to launch 3 observatories initially, a North American, a European observatory, and an Australian observatory. Those 3, over just the last couple of years, have developed into 8. I'm only showing 6 of them here. In each of the continents, with the exception of Antarctica, and in a couple of cases with more than one on the same continent. We've got 2 Asian observatories. I've led for the last 10 years approximately a research network in the Nordic countries called the Nordic Network for Interdisciplinary Environmental Studies. It now is playing a leading role in the organization of a new observatory within this framework as well, which is the Circumpolar Observatory for Humanities for the Environment. Nice has already a long and pretty active history over the last 10 years, organizing and galvanizing, I would say, the environmental humanities in the Nordic countries. It's played a big role in the Nordic country. It hasn't been the only actor doing that, but it's been a significant actor doing that. We've produced, we tend to have symposia that produce books around certain questions, different questions, and where we've been sort of very aggressively interdisciplinary in our constitution. We try to make sure that we have events that draw together people from environmental history, from geography, from philosophy, from literary studies, and from a range of other disciplinary backgrounds as well. Taking a focused look at a particular theme or a particular research question. And that's included, by the way, in the far right bottom corner there. You see we've had field schools that we've organized as well, where when we're trying to build capacity with doctoral students and younger scholars, postdocs, we've gone into the field, which is something that literary scholars never, I mean, going into the field as a literary scholar usually means, going into the stacks of a library maybe, and then into your little carrel and attack the book. So what we've done when we begin working more and more with archaeologists, people who do work in the field, and with geosciences specialists, with people doing other anthropologists doing ethnographic work, and together with environmental historians and people with other backgrounds as well, is we organize an intensive academic course in the north of Iceland, right on the edge of the northern Icelandic wilderness, where we balance academic lectures, like in these kinds of settings, not quite this huge, but in a regular academic setting with field studies virtually every day throughout the program, and visiting active archaeological sites, and that helps build capacity and understanding across disciplinary lines, which we've needed to do as we begin thinking more and more about how we can work together in cohesive ways that actually can say something meaningful. So what discourses have our conferences in the environmental humanities in the Nordic region brought together? Well, I just have a little bit of a laundry list here. You can see here that not all of these are subject areas and there are specific disciplines in their own right. Some of them might already be interdisciplinary subject areas like gender studies or like landscape studies. But what we've tried to do is draw around certain key focal questions that actually relate to real-world issues and problems that are going on right now, that we feel humanists have something to say about, and we should make that knowledge available. We've organized smaller workshops of sometimes 30, 40. The biggest one we've ever done is 80 people or so, where we can actually address everything in plenum, so everybody's hearing from everybody else over the course of several days, rather than sort of going into our own little disciplinary ghettos where we're not talking to each other, because we can learn from one another, and we need to learn from one another. But I think, how am I doing on time?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. I'd like to unpack a few assumptions about, how do these different disciplines and study areas that I just put up there relate to one another, and how do they relate to the rest of the scientific or academic landscape? Here, I think it's worth going back to the end of that quote I showed you before from Ursula Heise, where she says, "The challenge for the environmental humanities lies in staking out common conceptual and methodological ground between distinct disciplinary research areas." That's my paraphrase of her. As well as in how environmental perspectives are articulated differently within the framework of particular disciplines. The environmental humanities, whatever they are, they're not a settled domain at the moment. They have a sort of an area history that goes back decades and decades in some subjects and is much more recent in others. There are competing uses of this term, environmental humanities. The first competing use of this term is one that tends to identify environmental humanities with a particular disciplinary tradition located often from within the spectrum of traditional humanities subjects. Eco-criticism or literature and environment studies might be one, environmental history, environmental philosophy, environmental anthropology or archaeology. Such a conception of environmental humanities may align it more with a philosophical tradition that would be very familiar to everybody in this room, I think. It might not be engaging with the sciences, natural or social sciences, as kindred academic disciplines. That's at least the conception of the work that's being done. And this view of the environmental humanities tends to view this area reductively in many cases, or rather, pardon me, within this internal sort of viewpoint of environmental humanities from the people working in this humanistic tradition. They might see natural sciences as a bit too positivistic. Such a conception of environmental humanities may not actually have scientific aspirations. It may, in fact, aspire to philosophical, historical, or cultural analytical ends. Now we can put that side by side with another use of the term environmental humanities that we come across. And this is broadly typical of how the humanities is characterized more generally. And this may identify the domain as a catch-all for so-called soft approaches, meaning in effect cultural, aesthetic, philosophical orientations. And this use tends to derive from outside the spectrum of humanities subjects. So disciplines are viewed in equally reductive terms as somewhat interchangeable from a normative, from an extra-humanistic perspective, and as qualitative, contextual, perhaps relativistic, unconcerned with actual environments, concerned instead with cultural mediation and or social construction of nature. This second, say, natural sciences normative sense is one that I think we recognize a lot when we come across calls for funding, for research funding. When the humanities is involved as a desirable element often in largely natural sciences-oriented research funding programs, the contribution that might be sought is often reduced to the status of an add-on, often framed in essentially instrumental terms, for instance, a function that can help in the popular transmission of research findings, as a communicative enhancement having a largely translational function. Typically not playing an important role in the formulation of research questions, and therefore not part of the answer either. I think the problem, if we take a look at these two different types of environmental humanities, sort of dominant ones, is that either, especially in the latter case, humanities are seen as useful, but not necessarily important to the knowledge domain. And here I would argue that to view humanities and social sciences actually in instrumental terms like this as facilitating the translation of scientific knowledge into an accessible language for policymakers is to perpetuate deficiencies in the larger scientific assessment and policy processes that have tended to reinforce a disjuncture between science and public understanding on the one hand and between the current state of knowledge and best informed policy on the other. The answer to this, I think, is, and this is the approach that we've been taking in the Nordic region, is the idea of integrated environmental humanities. And this is one that builds upon very much the kind of approach towards integrating social sciences more effectively into the global change research agenda that we've seen coming out of, for instance, a few years ago, the International Social Science Council with their transformative cornerstones report. What might this look like? Well, it could look something, I just realized now that I've been not going through these slides, I've been going through them only on my computer. I apologize for that. But it might look something like this, just to catch up. Pardon me? In this view of integrated environmental humanities, what's important, I think, is what's happening there in the middle. This is not a challenge to the autonomy or the integrity of traditional disciplines. It's actually a way of rethinking how we work together and how we draw on one another's knowledge base around certain sets of questions. And those questions will yield the constellation that may make up the petals of this flower here. We still need those petals in terms of their own integrity. We need the core disciplines. Without that, we don't really have legs to stand on. So the vital work that's taking place is taking place in that intersection in the middle, and sometimes in bilateral interstices or in these overlapping areas as well. And that may be work that's more of a multidisciplinary nature, and what's going on in the middle might be more of an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary nature. I'm about out of time, so I'm going to just end with a couple of thoughts about what defines that center and what we can aim for in this version of environmental humanities. This is the third kind. There I would say that established disciplines and emerging communities of practice working together with a reintegration of knowledge communities. We would not have one discipline working in the service of another as a kind of an add-on, but experts from a range of knowledge communities addressing problems through co-formulation of relevant research questions, problem-oriented research, question-driven research, in other words, and coordinated disciplinary responses that involve complementary methodologies, not common or the same methodologies, and complementary, not identical theoretical framings. This is not about one discipline taking over the other one or edging the other one out. It's about how we can work together more effectively by bringing to the table the different knowledge that we have and the different approaches we have. And I'll end with this thought. This is not interdisciplinarity for its own sake or in the abstract. It's interdisciplinarity as an appropriate response to complex questions. The environmental issues that we're dealing with now in the world are not the kinds of issues that any single discipline, whether in the natural sciences, the social sciences, or the humanities, are going to be able to tackle on their own. We need a great deal more collaboration. We need a great deal more crossing of divides between scientific domains. And the only way we can do that is begin to respect that without actually turning to the people who know a tremendous amount about humans and about the human and the role of the human in relation to its world and the role of the human in relation to other humans and the challenges that they have inhabiting that world together. Without turning to that knowledge base, we're going to have an extremely poor academically or scientifically formed environmental policy. And this, I think, is one approach that we can be taking that would lead us more in the direction towards cohesion and unlocking knowledge that's in those different silos. So I'm going to have to end with that thought, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. Merci beaucoup, Stephen. En tout cas, d'avoir donné à l'interdisciplinarité non seulement un squelette, mais aussi de la chair et du contenu. Alors, le troisième orateur de cet après-midi sera François Djindjian. François Djindjian a un parcours un peu atypique, puisqu'il est d'abord un électricien, si je puis m'exprimer ainsi, un physicien du solide et de la statistique, et puis il a tenté de satisfaire son goût de l'archéologie, et il a fait des études d'archéologie. Et il est devenu, si je puis m'exprimer ainsi, l'homme du paléolithique supérieur, ou du moins un des hommes du paléolithique supérieur, avec Janusz Koslowski, qui est dans la salle, et avec Marcel Ott, qui d'ailleurs appartient à cette université, ici à Liège. Ils ont publié un volume assez intéressant et définitif, du moins pour autant qu'il le reste dans le temps, sur le paléolithique supérieur en Europe. François Djindjian est aussi l'homme de la cabane à mammouth, à os de mammouth, puisqu'il fouille depuis des années en Ukraine, à Gonsi. Il est le vice-président de l'Union internationale, le trésorier de l'Union internationale des sciences préhistoriques et protohistoriques, et il est aussi depuis quelques années le vice-président du Conseil international de la philosophie et des sciences humaines. Je lui cède volontiers la parole.
Merci mon cher Jean-Luc. J'en ai rougi de honte ou de fausse modestie à l'énoncé de toutes les turpitudes passées. Alors, 20 minutes, c'est très court. Donc, il faut appuyer sur quel bouton déjà?
Le central.
C'est le central. Très bien. Alors, je vais en fait vous donner les conclusions et la synthèse de la session que nous avons organisée ici, qui s'intitule Human Peopling and Climate, Adaptation and Sustainability, organisée avec mon ami le professeur Janusz Kozlowski, et sous l'égide de l'Union internationale des sciences préhistoriques et protohistoriques, une session qui a duré 2 jours. Et donc je vais essayer de vous résumer 2 jours de communication en 20 minutes. Alors, il y a 3 façons de vous présenter les rapports entre les sociétés humaines du passé et leur environnement et les changements climatiques. La première, c'est de parler à la place des sociétés du passé. Elles ne sont pas là pour se défendre. Donc c'est comme par exemple le livre Sapiens de M. Harari. Vous pouvez également prendre chez les archéologues des exemples qui vont appuyer vos théories personnelles malthusiennes. C'est par exemple Jared Diamond. Et vous avez une 3e solution qui est de mettre en œuvre des procédures scientifiques pour reconstituer les sociétés du passé et leur environnement. Et dans ce cas, ce n'est pas vous qui les faites parler, c'est eux qui parlent. Et ils ont beaucoup de choses à dire parce que, eh bien, les archéologues se sont mis au service des sociétés du passé pour les ressusciter. Et sans être influencés, et c'est important, par les textes anciens qui déjà au début de l'écriture réécrivent l'histoire, mais pour vérifier ces textes eux-mêmes. Et donc ça, c'est le rôle des archéologues dans le monde scientifique. Et donc je vais vous montrer quelques-uns des résultats auxquels on est arrivé sur le sujet qui nous intéresse ici. Ah non, ça c'est pas pour avancer. Ça c'est pour... Non. Ah, le verrou. Voilà. Merci. Alors je vais me mettre un petit peu ici parce que je voudrais vérifier. Mais pas trop près d'autres. D'accord. Ok, thank you. Ah, ok, merci. Alors voici ce que fait un archéologue. Il fouille un site archéologique. Ce sont les plus vieilles cabanes de l'humanité. C'est un site que nous fouillons avec nos collègues ukrainiens depuis 25 ans. Ce sont les premières architectures. Ce sont des cabanes en os de mammouth. Et vous pouvez imaginer que la relation avec le mammouth est essentielle dans ce peuplement, qui est un peuplement de l'ensemble du bassin du Dniepr, en Ukraine et en Russie méridionale, et de l'ensemble du bassin du Don. Alors, ça, c'est le rôle des archéologues, mais le rôle des archéologues, c'est aussi ça, sur le même site, une séquence de lœss et de sols fossiles sur 200 000 ans que nous étudions pour reconstituer eh bien, l'ensemble des changements climatiques du passé. Et vous voyez ici un ensemble de résultats qui sont des courbes de susceptibilité magnétique, qui sont un bon estimateur de courbes climatiques. Et au passage, je voudrais vous montrer là où il y a les 2 personnes. Eh bien, c'est l'ensemble du complexe des sols fossiles du stade isotopique 5, entre 115 000 et 75 000 ans. Grande période interglaciaire qui, effectivement, nous intéresse ici. L'habitat que nous fouillons est situé au niveau, il y a 15 000 ans, au niveau tout en haut de la séquence. Et c'est la seconde plus importante séquence climatique de l'Ukraine. Et donc, vous voyez, les archéologues sont aussi des paléoclimatologues. Et ceci est important. Alors, pour nous qui sommes des spécialistes du passé profond, eh bien, nous avons l'habitude des changements climatiques. Et peut-être que nous sommes inconscients, mais nous en avons moins peur, puisque si nous sommes ici aujourd'hui toujours vivants, cela veut dire que les hommes du passé ont réussi à vaincre les difficultés des climats trop froids et trop secs, comme des climats trop chauds et trop humides. Et donc, grâce à nos collègues devenus aujourd'hui paléoclimatologues, nous avons des courbes extrêmement précises, mais pas aussi précises que nous voudrions, parce que sur certaines périodes, nous sommes demandeurs de précision à l'année près, et sur d'autres périodes, nous sommes demandeurs de précision à 500 ans près, et il est certain que nos amis climatologues préfèrent chercher la carotte la plus longue jusqu'à 1 million, 1,5 million ou 2 millions, plutôt que de s'embêter à nous faire du pixel très fin sur des séquences courtes. Ça, s'il y a des paléoclimatologues dans la salle, venez me voir après. Alors, c'est simplement pour vous rappeler très vite que deux grands épisodes climatiques, mais il y en a d'autres, le 15 et le 11, il y a 600 000 ans et 400 000 ans, très grande période chaude et humide. C'est l'époque où l'Homo erectus a colonisé toute l'Eurasie en remontant jusqu'à des latitudes très élevées dans le continent eurasiatique. L'homme de Néandertal, que vous connaissez par cœur parce qu'il est devenu très médiatique, c'est un homme qui, après ces épisodes très chauds, a connu cet épouvantable épisode glaciaire que l'on appelait avant le Riss et qui correspond aux stades isotopiques 6, 8 et 10 et qui a connu un refroidissement considérable. L'homme de Néandertal s'est adapté à cet environnement froid et sa morphologie, morphocrânienne et le reste, c'est un homme habitué au grand froid et donc il est resté sur le continent eurasiatique depuis l'extrémité de l'Europe occidentale jusqu'en Asie centrale en s'adaptant à ce climat-là. Mais il a quand même eu la chance d'avoir cet épisode climatique du stade 5 où cette fois-ci il a pu repeupler l'ensemble des continents. Et puis il a eu le malheur d'avoir le stade isotopique 4, qui est encore un stade très froid, où cloisonné dans l'Europe, eh bien ces traits morphocrâniens se sont encore plus caricaturés, donnant cette image malheureusement fausse de l'homme de Néandertal, qui était un hominidé extrêmement intelligent, grand et fin tailleur, grand chasseur, et certainement, si je le rencontrais dans le métro, je le reconnaîtrais, mais je pense qu'il m'apprendrait encore énormément de choses à moi, pauvre petit Homo sapiens. Alors ensuite, nous avons le peuplement de l'homme moderne. Celui-là, il arrive vraisemblablement autour du stade isotopique 3. Cela n'est pas un interglaciaire, c'est un interpléniglaciaire. Il a la chance d'avoir un réchauffement. C'est un climat non pas chaud, mais tempéré, mais le niveau de la mer n'a pas eu le temps de descendre. Et donc, le climat tempéré lui permet une mobilité des déplacements et donc des peuplements à longue distance. Et là, le niveau de la mer qui est encore bas, suite à l'OIS 4, lui permet de franchir plus facilement des détroits, de coloniser des îles qui sont rattachées au continent. Bref, c'est grâce à ça qu'il arrive à peupler l'Australie et très vraisemblablement le continent américain, si l'on se base sur les résultats archéologiques de l'Amérique du Sud et pas de l'Amérique du Nord, et je vous expliquerai pourquoi tout à l'heure. Alors dans cette OIS 3, il est suivi par cette OIS 2, qui est le dernier maximum glaciaire, une période terriblement froide et terriblement sèche. Et donc, c'est l'épisode dans lequel je ne vous conseille pas de vivre. Eh bien, cet épisode, il est récent, entre 22 000 et 17 000. Le glacier alpin est descendu jusqu'à la ville de Lyon. Et donc, pour mon ami Gilbert Kennel et pour mon ami Tissot, malheureusement, l'ensemble de la Suisse est entièrement recouverte du glacier et il faut trouver un endroit pour héberger les pauvres banques suisses qui seront obligées d'aller s'installer ailleurs. Et donc, mais il n'y a pas seulement l'Europe, donc nous avons quasiment un abandon du peuplement de l'Europe moyenne et de l'Europe septentrionale et un refuge dans des zones méditerranéennes qui sont la péninsule ibérique, la péninsule italienne et le golfe Adriatique, et le pourtour de la mer Noire. Et comme la mer est descendue à moins 130 mètres, la mer Noire est un lac, et donc le peuplement se fait autour du lac. Et la mer Égée est quasiment une mer fermée, puisque les îles se sont presque toutes rejointes, et donc on vit autour de ce semi-lac qui est devenu la mer Égée. La situation n'est pas meilleure ailleurs, et je vais vous montrer la carte du monde au dernier maximum glaciaire, et vous voyez que le continent africain est une des plus grandes victimes de cette époque, puisque l'ensemble de la moitié nord de l'Afrique est devenu un immense Sahara, et qu'il ne reste plus que quelques peuplements résiduels d'Ibéro-Maurusiens sur la côte, alors que à l'OIS 3, l'ensemble de ce continent nord-africain était entièrement peuplé par une culture que l'on appelle l'Athérien et dont l'homme était un homme moderne. Et la zone équatoriale est très réduite. L'Afrique du Sud, le sud de l'Afrique représente l'équivalent de l'Afrique du Nord, et le peuplement de l'Afrique du Sud se réduit à un peuplement très côtier. Nos aborigènes australiens, qui étaient très contents d'avoir découvert un nouveau continent, se retrouvent au maximum glaciaire avec un continent qui est inhabitable. Et il ne reste plus pour nos aborigènes australiens qu'à l'abandonner pour aller se remettre au nord, en Nouvelle-Guinée, ou alors sur la côte orientale. Et puisque l'île de Tasmanie est maintenant rattachée au continent australien, ils viennent se réfugier dans l'île de Tasmanie. Et quand après le climat va changer à l'Holocène, l'île de Tasmanie va se retrouver isolée du continent et la population tasmanienne n'aura plus aucun rapport avec le reste des populations australiennes qui sont redescendues pour occuper les meilleures parties de l'Australie. Vous voyez que le continent nord-américain est devenu un gigantesque glacier, et il ne reste plus qu'au sud des États-Unis et au niveau même du Mexique, vous voyez qu'il est très désertique. Donc il ne reste plus que des très petites parties qui sont habitables. Et au passage, l'Inland 6 a supprimé tous les sites archéologiques des premiers habitants du continent américain venus par la Sibérie. Et donc ce qui explique à quel point il est inutile d'aller chercher le premier habitant de l'Amérique au nord. Si vous voulez aller le chercher, il faut aller le chercher en Amérique centrale ou en Amérique du Sud. En Europe, vous voyez l'Inland 6, vous voyez toute la zone de la Sibérie, eh bien toute cette zone est entièrement dépeuplée. L'Asie centrale est dépeuplée, l'Iran est dépeuplé, le Moyen-Orient est quasiment dépeuplé, et donc vous voyez que la population de très faible démographie s'est énormément réduite. Heureusement, le changement climatique arrive. Et avec l'Holocène, eh bien, qu'est-ce qui se passe à l'Holocène? Eh bien, contrairement à ce que vous pensez, il n'y a pas de forêt primaire. La forêt, elle a 11 000 ans. Elle arrive parce que le climat change. Et là où il y avait une steppe froide, qui était la fameuse steppe à mammouth, à rhinocéros, et leurs autres collègues, eh bien maintenant, il y a la forêt qui pousse. Et la forêt, elle pousse à partir des arbres qui étaient redescendus dans les refuges, comme les autres animaux tempérés et comme les hommes, dans les refuges méditerranéens. Et en Europe, les chênes remontent. Ils remontent d'Espagne, ils remontent d'Italie, ils remontent des Balkans, etc. Et donc, eh bien, à la toundra steppe froide succède la toundra taïga, et donc c'est la grande colonisation forestière. Ce qui correspond, ce changement brutal, il n'y a plus de steppe froide, il y a toujours un peu de froid, de moins en moins, mais il y a beaucoup d'humidité, il y a donc de la neige, et donc les grands mammifères, pendant l'hiver, les 6 mois de l'hiver n'ont plus la nourriture, et donc ils meurent tous de faim, et on a donc une disparition naturelle de l'ensemble de ces animaux, qui n'a rien à voir avec l'homme, qui a à voir tout simplement avec un changement de climat qui est dû à la rotation de la Terre et à ses variations sur son axe. Le chasseur de steppe, qui adorait chasser des troupeaux de 10 000 têtes de rennes ou de 2000 têtes de bison, se retrouve dans la forêt à courir après 2 lapins et un chevreuil, et donc il commence à trouver que ce n'est pas assez pour se nourrir, et donc il va commencer à manger sur les côtes des coquillages, ce qui nous amène ces grandes escargotières que nous trouvons à cette époque-là. L'Holocène ancien est une période qui est intéressante, c'est une période qui est plus chaude qu'aujourd'hui, et le niveau de la mer est à peu près à 3,50 m au-dessus du niveau actuel. Et donc, en particulier, le plus spectaculaire, c'est ce qui se passe en Afrique dans la partie nord de l'Afrique. C'est la période que l'on appelle la période humide africaine, de 9800 à 2900, pendant 6000 ans. c'est un endroit d'invention de l'agriculture. Et ce n'est pas surprenant que vous trouviez dans l'art rupestre du Sahara, qui est aujourd'hui en plein désert, des girafes, des crocodiles, des hippopotames, toute une faune que vous trouvez un peu plus au sud actuellement en Afrique, et qui en plein Tibesti était la faune qui vivait là, dans une région très humide et dans une région d'agriculture. Et donc, et comme je vous laisse deviner que en climatologie, vous avez un climat glaciaire froid sec d'un côté, chaud humide de l'eau, plus chaud et humide de l'autre côté, plus vous avez du chaud, plus vous avez de l'humide. Et qu'est-ce qui va se passer dans les 3000 ou 4000 prochaines années au Sahara? Eh bien, il faut le regarder. Eh bien, vous avez toutes les chances que le Sahara devienne un petit peu plus vert qu'aujourd'hui. Les centres d'invention de l'agriculture, combien de temps il me reste?
3-4 minutes.
Alors, je vais aller plus vite. Les centres d'invention de l'agriculture, vous en avez plusieurs dans le monde, et grâce à ça, à partir du moment où l'ensemble des continents a été connecté, nous avons pu enrichir nos ressources alimentaires avec des aliments qui viennent des différents continents. Et aujourd'hui, il est probable que vous qui êtes Européens, vous ne savez pas que 99% des aliments que vous mangez viennent du Moyen-Orient, viennent d'Amérique du Sud, viennent d'autres continents. Et grâce à ça, eh bien, nous avons et en hommage à Nicolas Vavilov, qui en 1926 a été le premier à mettre en évidence cette théorie de l'origine des plantes cultivées. Le climat, malheureusement, à l'Holocène, subit des variations avec des poussées d'aridité. Alors, dans un climat tempéré ou chaud, on a toujours des pointes d'humidité et des pointes d'aridité. Et ces pointes d'aridité sont effectivement très embêtantes, surtout quand vous êtes parti dans les systèmes agro-pastoraux. Et donc, eh bien, il y a... Alors, ça varie. Par exemple, l'Holocène ancien au Moyen-Orient, quand il devient aride assez rapidement, cela pousse les populations du Moyen-Orient soit à migrer vers l'Europe, c'est grâce à ça que nous avons des agriculteurs en Europe, soit à transformer leur agriculture en tenant compte des spécificités géographiques des différents endroits du Moyen-Orient, soit à mettre en œuvre une infrastructure d'irrigation importante de façon à remplacer, je dirais, l'humidité du climat par une humidité artificielle construite par l'homme. Et l'autre solution, c'est le développement du nomadisme qui remplace les endroits où vous ne pouvez pas cultiver. Et donc, vous avez toutes ces solutions-là. Donc, vous avez des solutions où eh bien, les nomades sont venus remplacer les agriculteurs qui sont partis. C'est le cas du Sahara, de l'Asie centrale. Et vous avez des solutions où l'infrastructure s'est faite avec des irrigations importantes en Mésopotamie, en Asie centrale, avec des canaux d'une fantastique complexité et intelligence le long de l'Amou Daria et du Sir Daria, avec l'aménagement du Nil, avec les fameux barrages pour stopper, pour conserver l'eau en haut de crue, le Sud-Caucase grâce à la fonte des neiges, etc., etc. Ceci met en œuvre une population importante. Pour mettre en œuvre une population importante, vous devez commencer à structurer la société et donc à l'organiser socialement. Et comme disent certains, je n'aime pas ce mot, à la hiérarchiser, mais ça veut dire que vous avez une étatisation. L'étatisation est liée à la nécessité de continuer la mise en œuvre de ces systèmes agricoles. Alors voilà quelques-uns, je passe très vite là-dessus. Les systèmes d'irrigation, y compris les oasis, la culture du riz, etc. Les systèmes agraires de montagne, comme vous avez en Amérique du Sud sur la côte occidentale, comme vous avez au Liban, en Syrie, comme vous avez partout, vous avez des systèmes de montagne à plusieurs étages qui permettent de spécialiser suivant l'altitude, et également les zones immergées, comme par exemple les deltas. J'ai pris un exemple récent pour changer un peu, mais j'aurais pu vous parler du delta du Pô, avec les Romains, du delta du Nil, des marais poitevins, etc. Au Moyen-Âge, je passe très vite là-dessus, nous avons toujours des variations climatiques, et nous avons des variations climatiques qui sont des optimums climatiques au niveau de, juste avant, au niveau de l'an 1000, et puis le petit âge glaciaire qui commence, et qui est extrêmement bien documenté, et qui est indiscutable. Et donc, les variations climatiques au niveau de l'Holocène, pendant la période historique, sont des choses auxquelles il faut s'habituer, elles sont normales. Juste un petit trait d'humour, parce que j'ai encore 2 minutes pour finir. Un petit trait d'humour. Pour vous montrer que invoquer toujours le changement climatique pour expliquer les changements de société est un processus scientifique un peu trop caricatural et que tout est un petit peu plus complexe. Il faut fonctionner en termes de système. La Révolution française est-elle liée à l'explosion du fameux volcan Laki en 1783 qui a entraîné un climat pourri, des récoltes très pauvres, une spéculation sur la farine et entraînant des émeutes populaires dans les rues de Paris. C'est l'histoire de la Révolution, vous la connaissez par cœur. Est-ce que c'est ça l'explication de la Révolution française? Est-ce que c'est une gouvernance faible du roi Louis XVI, une société bloquée sans courage de réforme, malgré les efforts de Turgot, une banqueroute due à l'accumulation des dettes, grâce au banquier Necker qui en profitait, ou l'attitude sociale du peuple français qui voulait changer un petit peu les fondements de la société. Donc le changement climatique n'est jamais la seule explication, elle fait partie de l'explication, et il faut prendre en compte tous les processus de gouvernance, les processus d'attitude sociétale, les processus de sociabilité, les processus d'économie, etc., etc. Il est certain que quand Napoléon a fait des stocks de farine pour éviter que l'histoire se répète, cela a évité toute spéculation sur les blés et le prix du pain, et donc la question a été réglée. Alors, pour vous rassurer, après cette vision un peu dramatique que je vous ai dressée, je voudrais vous donner des signes d'optimisme. Quels sont les risques climatiques qui risquent de vous arriver prochainement? On parle, et on en parle tellement que ce n'est pas la peine que j'en parle, parce que vous en avez entendu beaucoup parler, le réchauffement du climat, plus chaud et plus humide, dû au développement des activités industrielles depuis la fin du XIXe siècle. Mais ce que vous ne savez pas, un événement très froid, brutal, mais court, ce qu'on appelle chez nous, et les climatologues, les événements de Heinrich, c'est en fait des grandes débâcles d'iceberg venant des inland seas du nord et du sud, et qui entraîne un événement comme nous l'avons connu il y a 11 000 ans avec le Dryas III. C'est parfaitement documenté dans l'histoire de l'humanité. Et donc, je vous souhaite qu'avec le réchauffement climatique, nous n'ayons pas de ce type de débâcle qui vont transformer complètement, par exemple, le Gulf Stream dans le nord de l'Atlantique. Vous pouvez avoir également des éruptions volcaniques importantes. On a parlé de plusieurs éruptions volcaniques depuis le Vésuve, les Philippines ou l'Islande. Mais nous en avons connu un qui a été très important. C'est, pour nous les préhistoriens, c'est l'explosion du volcan des Champs Flégréens à côté de Naples. Il a recouvert toute l'Europe d'une couche de cendres de 2 à 3 cm que nous retrouvons dans tous les sites archéologiques. Et donc il est à l'origine d'un grand refroidissement qui est le premier grand événement froid de l'OIS 3, qui pourtant est un climat tempéré, il y a 34 000 ans. Et enfin, mais ça n'est pas pour tout de suite, nous ne serons pas là pour le voir, le retour de l'âge glaciaire qui est programmé par la théorie de Milankovitch, puisque aujourd'hui nous sommes dans une période interglaciaire de l'Holocène qui dure 15 000 ans. 15 000 ans, c'est long pour un interglaciaire déjà. Nous allons avoir passé à l'arrivée de la glaciation future, mais ce sera peut-être dans 1000 ans, 2000 ans, 3000 ans, et ça va venir progressivement. Et donc, comme l'homme est infiniment intelligent et infiniment conscient des responsabilités qu'il a sur cette terre, et qu'il a la maîtrise des technologies incroyables, il saura trouver les solutions pour survivre dans le prochain interglaciaire et entre-temps pour supporter le prochain événement de Heinrich qui va sans doute arriver dans moins de 10 ans. Je vous remercie.
Merci François, c'était passionnant, tu nous as balayé 200 000 ans d'histoire en 24 minutes exactement, en l'enrichissant de considérations sur la biologie, sur la société, etc. Il y a une chose à laquelle sans doute tu ne pourras pas répondre, c'est quel temps fera-t-il à Liège demain?
Il faut consulter la météo.
Il faut consulter la météo, voilà. Il nous reste un dernier intervenant pour ce soir, et je suis désolé qu'il soit déjà 18h. C'est Timothy Lloyd qui a fait au fond toute sa carrière aux États-Unis et qui est un spécialiste du folklore, puisqu'il a été longtemps aussi à la tête de l'American Folklore Society. Il a eu la chance de voyager beaucoup dans le monde, d'être allé en France, pour voir des éco-musées notamment. Il est allé en Chine, je crois que c'est un proche aussi du président du CIPCH qui est Zhao Jiejin, notre ami chinois. Et donc je lui cède volontiers la parole pour qu'il lance les prolégomènes d'une discussion éventuellement après une intervention. Merci Timothy.
Thank you, Jean-Luc. Covering all of human-environment relations in a 90-minute period is quite a challenge. I will be brief because there's not much time left, and I want to allow time for any questions and discussion. But I do want to recognize the speakers on this session for all responding admirably to that challenge, each from their own perspective. I just want to add a few small points taken from ethnographic examples from my own field, the field of folklore studies, and particularly with work in the United States. Folklore studies is an ethnographic discipline, like several others with which you're certainly well acquainted. And it's gratifying to me that in recent years, more and more disciplines outside of the core ethnographic disciplines are adopting ethnographic methods as part of their work, as Adrienne mentioned early in her presentation. Stephen is exactly right. The problems that we deal with are much, much too complex for any one discipline or any one research method to be adequate. So we welcome that interdisciplinarity. One of the things that ethnography teaches you is that the traditional culture of a community offers resources to that community for understanding and dealing with human-environment relations, particularly as they change. For example, in the arid, dry parts of the American Southwest, where there's very little rain and what water there is comes primarily from snowmelt from the mountains in the spring, the management of water resources is a primary concern of a number of traditional communities, particularly I'm thinking of communities in northern New Mexico, where a great deal of the life of the community and the oral tradition of the community, particularly among men, is taken up with the management of water resources through a very intricate series of local systems of irrigation. And without the traditional cultural resources that help manage the natural resource, those communities would no longer survive. As a second example, let me tell you a brief story that was told to me by a folklore studies colleague who worked at one time with a community in north central Alaska. He and a group of men were out on a hunt one day, and they were surprised by a sudden and violent storm that engulfed all of them in a vast whiteness, out of which they had no idea where they had come from or how to get back there. What the men did was created a small temporary shelter for themselves and then sat down and started telling stories all the stories that they knew or had ever heard about the region that they were in. Stories about people, stories about animals, stories about natural resources. And ultimately, after 5 or 6 hours, of essentially opening their database up and looking at all the records, they figured out the right way to get back home. But what happens if there are obstacles to the productive use of these resources, or even to the remembrance of these resources? I will give you one small example, though it's certainly nonetheless important to the people who live it, and one that is large and vast. At the American Folklore Society lately, we have been working with the Pine Ridge Sioux Native American community in southwestern South Dakota. This is a community that the Pine Ridge people live on a Native American reservation that corresponds roughly to their traditional homeland, but it's much smaller than their traditional homeland. So they have not moved to a different place, but the circumstances of their lives are very different. This community has one of the highest rates of childhood obesity, of both youth and adult diabetes, of opioid addiction, of alcoholism, of depression, of suicide in the entire United States. This is a result of a complicated system that I'm sure some of you know, and a complicated history of social policies by the surrounding governments and, at best, benign neglect. But happily, within these communities of the Pine Ridge Reservation, there is a very strong cultural revitalization program going on now that involves language revitalization and the teaching of traditional art forms to young people as a way of maintaining the culture and maintaining the culture's resources for dealing with the community where they live. Finally, a much bigger problem. The problem, or the issue, of migration of millions and millions and millions of people from rural areas to urban areas across the globe, particularly in the global south and east. I've been doing a good deal of work in China in recent years. Just as one example of this, as I suspect you all know, tens of millions of Chinese have moved from farms and villages to cities in recent years. And the Chinese government is presently undertaking a plan to move an additional 250 million people from the, rural areas to urban areas in the next 20 years. That's over 34,000 people every single day for the next 20 years. And then you multiply this problem by the scale of similar processes that are going on in other countries, and you see the scale of the issue that we and they are facing. I don't want to pretend that what will happen to their culture is the most important, or certainly the only one of the issues facing the people who are experiencing this social and economic change. But I think it is a classic example of the problem that is of a scale and complexity that only many disciplines working together in the way these panelists have pointed out can we approach. Thank you.